In the previous lesson, we built out our CSS. Now let's apply that to the element that we're building dynamically using JavaScript. And if you didn't build out the CSS, you can copy and paste it out from the source files attached to this section. So we've got our HTML, and now we're going to be building out a second HTML container where we're going to be holding our other card elements. So we've got a small one and a big one. So it's going to look relatively the same, having the card and then also the suit, but we're not going to have a space between there, a line break. We also need to account for all of the current cards. So using document. So we want to position the cards a little bit over. So this is where we need to count how many existing cards there are on the page. So we're using the current cards object in order to contain all of that node list, just as we did with the buttons earlier. Now we go into creating the element, and the element that we've just created, so that div that we've just created, this is our main container where we're going to set an attribute to that element, and we're going to set an attribute of class because we don't have any content in the class yet, so that we can set it within this type of format where we're setting an attribute. And because we've positioned it absolute, we can take that div and we can position it to the left. And this is where we're going to calculate out how many current cards there are, what's the length of the current cards, multiply that by 25 so that we know where we're going to position the new card. So it's going to be moved over, every new card is going to be 25 over to the left. So that's going to a little bit of overlap to the new cards as we're building them out. Let's set a current card value. So our current card value, and this is that global object value that we have and that we set up in the beginning. So this is the one that's going to contain whatever the existing card is, and we're going to use this as our calculation when the player selects either higher or lower to determine what card is in play and what the value of that card is. And that's the only value that we actually need to know from the card. We don't need to know any more of this object information. We just need to know the current card value. So grabbing that, and once it's visually represented, we're going to hide that in the background and then use that to determine if it's higher or lower. We also need to use the card and check to see the suit. And if the suit is equal to hearts, then we know that it's going to be red. Or if the card is equal to suit and the suit is diamonds, then we're going to select that div, selecting the class list, because now we've already created that attribute class, so we need to add to it. So using JavaScript to select the class list, and just as we were before toggling it, we can add to it. So adding a value of red. This is the class that we created in the previous lesson, and all it's going to do is color the element text red. Now we also need to create those smaller units that we want to house. So let's create those. We can create one as a span, document, create element. So just as we did with the divs, let's create a span in order to hold this content. This is going to be the smaller of the span contents. So setting an attribute to it. So we're updating and giving it a class of tiny to match with the styling that we produced in the previous lesson. So span 1 will have an inner HTML, and this is where we're going to use that HTML2 structure for the card. So we can output that, and then we're going to append that span 1 to the div so that we haven't output the div yet, but we can also still append it to the div while we're building this card out. And then next, we need to build out another span. I'm going to copy this because some of the code is going to be very similar. So we'll call that span 2. So creating a span, we need to set an attribute to it. The attribute that we're setting, the class that we're starting out and setting it to, is big. Next, the span 2 and the inner HTML. This one is 1. So no, it's a little bit reversed there where we're using 1 and 2 in reverse there. And then we need to append it to the div. So we're appending span to the div. And then we're still ready to update and output that div. We can get rid of that inner HTML. And now let's try it out and see what our card looks like. So there we go. We've built out a card and we've got higher or lower. So right now these buttons aren't doing anything, and that's what we're going to introduce in the next lesson. So this time the objective was to build out a visual representation of the card, and next we need to make some actions for these buttons. So let's try that one more time. So the 9 of diamonds, start, the king of hearts, and this is a nice representation. And of course you can play around with the CSS and style it however you want. You can also add another tiny one here at the bottom. So depending on what you want your cards to look like. And for me, I think this is a good visual representation for the card. So I'm not going to do any more CSS, but of course you are welcome to update and adjust that as needed. So go ahead and add this part in where we're making the visual card, adding in and creating the elements on the fly, and then setting the different classes that are attached to those attributes, and then updating the inner HTML and appending those elements as needed to the parent in order to output it for the player.